On my 28th birthday, my stepfather and stepbrother gave me a cake that said, "Farewell, Marcus," then kicked me out of the condo I secretly supported for 7 years. 4 months later, they returned desperate after discovering the secret my late grandmother took to her grave. I, 28M, never thought my birthday would become the day my entire life changed forever. But as I stood in the living room of what I thought was my home, staring at a cake decorated with "Farewell, Marcus" in bright red frosting, I realized how wrong I'd been about everything. My stepfather stood behind the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, wearing that smug expression I'd grown to hate over the years. My stepbrother leaned against the wall nearby, scrolling through his phone like this was just another Tuesday. They'd planned this moment, and I could see the satisfaction in their eyes. My stepfather cleared his throat and announced that it was time for me to find my own place. He said I was old enough to be independent and that they needed the space. The words hit me like a physical blow, but what came next was worse. My stepbrother looked up from his phone and added that they'd already packed my things, pointing toward 2 suitcases by the door that I hadn't noticed when I walked in. I asked them if this was some kind of joke, but the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. This was real. After 7 years of living in this condo, contributing to every bill, buying groceries, and essentially keeping this place running, they were throwing me out like garbage. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 7 years, I'd been secretly paying the mortgage on this place. When my mother married my stepfather, she'd been struggling financially, and I'd quietly taken over the payments to help keep our family stable. I never told anyone because I wanted to protect her dignity and keep the peace. My stepfather thought he owned this place, but the deed had my grandmother's name on it, and she'd left it to me in her will before she passed away 2 years ago. I'd never mentioned the inheritance because my grandmother had made me promise to keep it secret until I was ready to use it. She'd been worried about family drama and wanted me to have something secure for my future. The condo was just one part of what she'd left me, but it was the part that had been keeping my stepfamily afloat without them knowing it. Standing there with that ridiculous cake mocking me, I made a decision. I told them I'd be out by the end of the week. My stepfather seemed surprised by how easily I accepted their ultimatum, but I could see relief in his face. He probably thought I'd fight or beg to stay. That night, I called my grandmother's lawyer and set everything in motion. Within 3 days, I'd moved my belongings to a storage unit and found a temporary apartment across town. I didn't tell my stepfamily where I was going, and I certainly didn't tell them what was about to happen to their comfortable little world. The eviction notice arrived exactly 1 week after my birthday. I wasn't there to see their faces, but I could imagine the confusion and panic when they realized the condo wasn't actually theirs. The legal documents clearly stated that the property belonged to me through my grandmother's estate, and that all residents needed to vacate within 30 days. My stepfather called me that same evening, his voice shaking with rage and confusion. He demanded to know what was happening and accused me of playing some kind of sick game. I calmly explained that the condo had belonged to my grandmother, who'd left it to me in her will. I told him I'd been paying the mortgage for 7 years to help the family, but since they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome, I saw no reason to continue supporting them. The conversation didn't last long. He hung up after calling me several names I won't repeat, but I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice toward the end. Update 1. 3 weeks passed in relative peace. I'd settled into my new apartment and was enjoying the freedom of not having to tiptoe around my stepfamily's moods. My job in IT consulting was going well, and I'd even started dating someone I'd met through work. Life was looking up. Then my stepbrother showed up at my office. He looked terrible. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. He asked if we could talk privately, and against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop nearby. He told me they'd been staying in a motel for the past week because they couldn't find anywhere else to go on such short notice. My stepfather had been calling in favors and trying to find temporary housing, but everything was either too expensive or unavailable. He said they'd underestimated how much I'd been contributing to the household expenses, and without my income, they couldn't afford much of anything. I listened without saying much, waiting to see where this was heading. Finally, he got to the point. He wanted to know if there was any way we could work something out. He suggested I could rent the condo to them, or maybe they could buy it from me over time. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I'd already made up my mind. They'd had 7 years to treat me like family, and instead, they'd treated me like a convenient ATM. The birthday cake stunt had been the final straw, but it wasn't the first time they'd made it clear I was an outsider in what I thought was my own home. He left looking defeated, and I went back to work feeling oddly satisfied. But I knew this wasn't over. Update 2. 2 weeks later, my mother called me for the first time since the eviction. I hadn't heard from her during this entire ordeal, which hurt more than I wanted to admit. She'd been traveling for work when everything happened, and my stepfamily had apparently decided not to tell her the full story. She was crying when I answered the phone. She said she'd just found out what had happened and couldn't believe her husband and son had kicked me out like that. She asked why I hadn't told her about the inheritance or the fact that I'd been paying for the condo all these years. I explained that I'd wanted to protect her from the financial stress and that grandmother had asked me to keep the inheritance quiet. I also told her about the birthday cake and how they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome in their family. She was quiet for a long time after that. She asked if there was anything she could do to fix this situation. She said she'd had no idea how badly they'd been treating me and that she felt terrible for not seeing it sooner. I could hear the genuine regret in her voice, but I also knew she was in a difficult position, caught between her son and her new family. I told her I loved her and that none of this was her fault, but that I couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. Too much had happened, and too many things had been said. She understood, but I could tell it was breaking her heart. After we hung up, I felt worse than I had in weeks. Hurting my mother wasn't part of the plan, but I couldn't see any way around it. My stepfamily had made their choice when they decided to humiliate me on my birthday, and now they had to live with the consequences. Update 3. For months after my birthday, I was working late at the office when security called to tell me I had visitors in the lobby. It was my stepfather and stepbrother, and they looked desperate. I almost told security to send them away, but curiosity got the better of me. They'd lost weight and looked like they'd been living rough for weeks. My stepfather's usual arrogance was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine desperation. They asked if we could talk somewhere private, and I led them to an empty conference room. What they told me next changed everything. They'd been digging through my grandmother's old papers, trying to find anything that might help their situation, when they discovered something that explained why she'd been so secretive about her will. Hidden in a box of old documents, they'd found evidence that my stepfather had been stealing money from my grandmother's accounts for years before she died. My stepfather broke down as he confessed that he'd been taking small amounts regularly, thinking she'd never notice because of her age. He said he'd used the money to pay for his son's college tuition and to cover some bad investments he'd made. He'd convinced himself it wasn't really stealing because he planned to pay it back eventually. But my grandmother had noticed. The documents showed that she'd been tracking every withdrawal and had even hired a private investigator to confirm her suspicions. She'd known exactly what was happening, but had chosen not to confront him directly. Instead, she'd quietly changed her will to ensure that her assets would go to someone she trusted me. My stepbrother added that they'd also found letters my grandmother had written but never sent, detailing her disappointment and explaining why she'd decided to leave everything to me. She'd written that she'd watched how I'd quietly supported the family without asking for recognition, and how I'd treated her with genuine love and respect even when others saw her as a burden. The final letter was addressed to me, explaining that she'd known about my secret mortgage payments and how proud she was of the man I'd become. She'd written that she hoped I'd use her inheritance wisely and that I shouldn't feel guilty about keeping it from people who'd already taken enough. Sitting in that conference room, watching my stepfather cry as he admitted to stealing from an elderly woman who trusted him, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite process. Part of me felt vindicated. My grandmother had seen through his act and had protected me in the only way she could. But another part of me felt sad for the family that could have been if people had just been honest from the beginning. My stepfather begged me to forgive him and asked if there was any way we could start over. He promised to pay back every penny he'd stolen and said he'd do whatever it took to make things right. My stepbrother echoed his father's pleas, adding that they'd learned their lesson and just wanted their family back together. I looked at these two men who'd made my life miserable for years, who'd humiliated me on my birthday and thrown me out like trash, and I felt nothing but pity. They weren't sorry for what they'd done to me. They were sorry they'd been caught and were facing the consequences. I told them I'd think about their request, but that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. I said they'd have to prove they'd changed through their actions, not just their words, and that it would take time to see if they were genuine. They left looking hopeful, but I'd already made my decision. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. They'd shown me who they really were on my 28th birthday, and discovering my grandmother's secret only confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Update 4. 6 months have passed since that conversation, and I've built a life I'm genuinely happy with. I kept the condo, but decided to rent it out to a nice family who actually appreciates having a decent place to live. The rental income covers the mortgage and gives me some extra financial security. My stepfather and stepbrother eventually found jobs and a small apartment they can afford together. My mother moved in with them temporarily to help with expenses, which was her choice, though it strained our relationship for a while. We talk regularly now, and she's slowly coming to understand why I couldn't just forgive and forget. I never did respond to their final plea for reconciliation. Some people might think I'm being too harsh, but I learned something important from this whole experience. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. For 7 years, I'd accepted being treated as less than family while secretly supporting them financially. The birthday cake was just the final symbol of how they really saw me. My grandmother's inheritance turned out to be more substantial than I'd initially realized. Beyond the condo, she'd left me investments and savings that have given me financial independence I never expected. But more than the money, she'd given me the gift of seeing my situation clearly and the tools to change it. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd told them about the inheritance from the beginning, or if I confronted my stepfather about his theft when I first discovered it. But I think my grandmother was right to keep her secrets. Some people only show their true character when they think no one is watching or when they believe there are no consequences for their actions. The woman I'd started dating during this whole ordeal is now my girlfriend, and she knows the entire story. She says she admires how I handled the situation, though she thinks I could have been more direct about my feelings earlier. Maybe she's right, but I'd spent so many years trying to keep the peace that I'd forgotten how to stand up for myself. These days, when people ask me about family drama, I tell them that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling bad behavior. My stepfamily had to learn how to survive without my financial support, and while it was difficult for them, they're probably stronger for it now. I still think about my grandmother often, especially when I'm making decisions about money or relationships. She taught me that love isn't just about what you're willing to give. It's also about having enough self-respect to walk away when someone consistently shows you they don't value what you're offering. The condo sits in a nice neighborhood now, home to a family who sends me thank you cards during the holidays and takes care of the property like it's their own. Sometimes I drive by just to see the garden they've planted in the front yard, and I think my grandmother would approve of how things turned out. As for the birthday cake with "Farewell, Marcus" written in red frosting, I never did get to taste it. But looking back, I think it was the sweetest gift my stepfamily ever gave me, because it finally showed me exactly where I stood and gave me the motivation to build something better.